A very good evening to all of you. My name is Danny Kuan. I am Lee Ka-shing Professor in Economics and Vice Dean here at the Lee Kuan Yew School. And it is my great pleasure to welcome everyone tonight to the Center on Asia and Globalization's 12th Hong Xiu Ching Lecture. The Hong Xiu Ching Speaker and Seminar Series is named in honor of Mr. Tay Liam Wee's late mother, and it is funded by a generous gift to the Center on Asia and Globalization from Mr. Tay. It is an especially great honor for us this evening that Tan Sri Dato Dr. Rebecca Fatima Santa Maria, Senior Policy Fellow at the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, will deliver tonight's Hong Xiu Ching Lecture on ASEAN economic integration, myth or reality. Tan Sri Rebecca is no stranger to those of us who have worked on anything having to do with ASEAN, economic integration, or trade and development policy across Southeast Asia. She was, until July last year, Secretary General of Malaysia's Ministry of International Trade and Industry. And in that post, as you know, she conceptualized and spearheaded Malaysia's trade and industrial policies throughout that crucial time immediately following the Lehman collapse and the ensuing global financial crisis. This period of time saw Malaysia negotiate critical bilateral and regional free trade agreements, including overseeing the progress of RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. All of these things, obviously, Tan Sri Rebecca played central and critical roles. She chaired the ASEAN Senior Economic Officials Meeting and the ASEAN High-Level Task Force for Economic Integration. I suspect that everything that I've said, many of us in this room probably already know. What many people might not know is that Tan Sri Rebecca is also an accomplished maestro in the kitchen. She has written a highly acclaimed cookbook comprised of family recipes. I hope I'm not giving anything away, but a highly acclaimed cookbook comprised of family recipes of diverse, varied, and multicultural home-cooked foods from her own childhood and adult years. And the reason I bring this up is that we can now see that Tan Sri Rebecca's skilled maneuvering of delicate trade negotiations and industrial policies will have been both inspired by and added deftness to her mastery in this rich slipstream of what she herself describes as heritage and comfort food centered around a family in deeply multicultural Malaysia, where members still struggle to define themselves by race. Tan Sri Rebecca has agreed to speak to us for 45 minutes on the topic of ASEAN Economic Community, after which we will have a general question and answer session. Could I invite all the members of this audience to join me in welcoming Tan Sri Rebecca to the stage?
I will begin with some background, and then I will proceed to highlight three core areas that, in my opinion, would enable ASEAN to make its economic integration real for us. In December 1981, my first assignment when I took up my post at the then Ministry of Trade and Industry in Kuala Lumpur was as a rapporteur for an ASEAN meeting. I think it was the Senior Economic Officials meeting. At that time, there were only 5 ASEAN member states: Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, and Thailand. ASEAN was then just 14 years old, but work to deepen economic integration was already underway. My ASEAN experience has been enlightening. I watched ASEAN grow from 5 founding members to Brunei's entry in 1984, Vietnam in 1995, Laos and Myanmar in 1997, and on April 30th, 1999, Cambodia became the 10th member of ASEAN. So you fast forward to 2015, and we witness the fruition of years of work towards creating an ASEAN Economic Community. This slide just shows us how, in numbers, how it's grown from where we were in 1990 to where we were in 2015. That's one thing that we have to get the Secretariat to work on. The ASEAN Secretariat, well, it's partly also member states. Our data is always a couple of years behind. While individual countries like Singapore and Malaysia could have our data right through, October 2017, but when you accumulate ASEAN, some of the states are less, they have the data collection is still a problem. So, anyways, that sort of gives you an impression of where we were and where we've come. We've come a long way. So while the impetus for the establishment of ASEAN may have been political, the progress of the grouping has, to a large extent, hinged on its economic integration. This also gives you, this is a much quoted slide telling, showing where we are, third largest market in the world, all these numbers, and where we are as a group. So collectively, we are a force to be reckoned with. If you look just purely on numbers, and this is the latest thing, they say by 2030, ASEAN as a whole will be the fourth largest economy in the world. Now, I think this is assuming status quo, okay? That everybody else grows at the same pace. And so that's a statistic that is much thrown around. So right from their first meeting in Jakarta in 1975, the ASEAN economic ministers focused on economic integration. However, it was then largely limited to trade and tourism. The steps at integration took the form of providing trade preferences through preferential trading arrangement, the ASEAN PTA. In a sense, this was a confidence-building measure, as the 5 members of the region were fledgling economies pretty much focused on commodities. I remember as an officer going through the list of products and saying, okay, when the ministers meet next time, here are some of the products we can put into this basket for tariff reduction. We didn't even talk of tariff elimination then. It was only at the 4th ASEAN Summit in Singapore in January 1992 that the ASEAN leaders signed a framework agreement for enhancing ASEAN economic cooperation. This laid the foundation for the ASEAN Free Trade Area through the agreement on the common effective preferential tariff. So it took us a number of years to get to that stage of conceptualizing ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, Free Trade Area. And this is important so that we understand how ASEAN has really taken slow, measured steps to get to where it is. While some folks look at that as a positive, there are just as many who are critical of the way we've gone about doing this. The other is ASEAN member states also did not just look at integration through the lens of trade in goods, but also through services. We recognize the importance of services in the global economy, so the ministers then guided the process for the implementation of the ASEAN Framework Agreement on Services, and they signed AFAS in 1995 in Bangkok. So when you think about it, in 1995, we were, in a sense, ahead of our time as a community, when you also consider the fact that, these were less or very much developing countries. So AFAS aimed at enhancing cooperation to improve the efficiency, competitiveness, and supply of services and liberalize further trade in services among member states. There was also the realization that direct investment was important for sustaining the pace of economic, industrial, infrastructure, and technological development in the region. So to achieve these, the ASEAN Investment Agreement was signed in October 1998 in Makati. And this aimed at attracting higher and sustainable levels of direct investment flows into and within the region through more liberal and transparent investment environment. I think the operative word here is transparent. This is something that we still struggle with, the issue of transparency of our rules and regulations as a community. These developments, if you look at how we did trade in goods, and then we went on to services, investment, and each of these are measured and implemented in stages, in phases. So this is a very deliberate process. One would say a thoughtful, deliberate process towards economic integration. But as I said earlier, ASEAN is often criticized for the slow pace of development. And yes, some of us are impatient for bolder, faster integration of the region. And I'll talk about this a little bit more. So it was only when the economic ministers realized that measures towards the ASEAN free trade area were progressing, well, did they, in 2006, take the next step of deepening economic integration through the drawing up of the ASEAN Economic Community Blueprint 2015. Now, the ASEAN economic ministers, under the chair of then Tan Sri Rafidah Aziz, Malaysia's then Minister of International Trade and Industry, she decided that ASEAN was ready to take that next important step. So in 2006, she basically forced the senior economic officials to work on crafting what she then conceived as a community, an ASEAN Economic Community. That was the first time we even talked about it, was in 2006. And she said, and let's have the AEC not 2020. At that time, we were all focused on ASEAN Vision 2020. So all of us were looking at, forming this community by 2020. But Rafidah says, look, the trade in goods, we've done quite well. We're progressing with services. Let's just go ahead, bite the bullet, and have an ASEAN Economic Community by 2015. So she brought the deadline forward. And so she just told the officers, go ahead and do it. So, at that time, I chaired the ASEAN Senior Economic Officials meeting. So we basically were scrambling over how do we make sure we get this. And if you're familiar with Rafidah Aziz, she works very fast. Everything must be like, I needed that yesterday kind of person. So, and she said, we will be launching it, we will sign it when the next year when Singapore is chair of ASEAN. So we had a very small window to get this done. Anyway, so what we did was we consulted the business community, we engaged the sectoral groups to ensure that we took a holistic view of economic integration. We also had discussions with our counterparts from the EU. Chris is here. And this was also part of our own learning, because we were like, how do we do this? How do we put this together? But we must stress that the final document was not modeled after any other regional bloc. We crafted the ASEAN Economic Community integration in our own mold, taking on board development concerns of each member state. We had Singapore on one end, and then you had Myanmar on the other end. So if you're talking of an ASEAN Economic Community and you're talking about ASEAN Economic Integration, it's how do we do this? How do we marry all these this varied group of countries? So that was a major challenge for us. And so we talked about it, and we with the business community, with the sectoral groups, and we decided that, we'll do it the ASEAN way. And we immediately wrote off the fact that we didn't want to look like the EU. We didn't want to have a customs union. But what we wanted was an inclusive organization, an inclusive regional grouping. So key to this was the special and differential treatment. Well, this was borrowed from the WTO, the World Trade Organization. So we said, because of the varying stages of development, and if we consider the whole of ASEAN as a rising tide, then you must incorporate special and differential treatment so that we can narrow that development gap. So if you read ASEAN documents, economic documents, you'll come across these terms: narrowing development gap and special and differential treatment. So that was core to the ASEAN Economic Blueprint. So if you look at what we tried to do in 2015, it was the dream. It was a dream. Myth, I'm not sure, but definitely it was our dream. So it was for us an important starting point. But we also figured that, you have a document of this nature, it's not good enough. You need to have a more systematic way of gauging what you have achieved. So we then designed also the AEC scorecard, and that's the first time for ASEAN. In the past, it was, we just put those things in place. We didn't monitor, every meeting, we just assumed people would do what they're supposed to do. So this is the first time we had an ASEAN scorecard, the AEC scorecard, to track implementation of those measures. There was some apprehension, I must say there was apprehension on the part of officials, and anxiety also, because this was a first attempt at a candid assessment of our progress. There was fairly intense discussion about the form of reporting. Are we ready for a public naming and shaming? Should we have two versions of the scorecard, one sanitized version for the public, and another more, candid for the ministers and the leaders? After much debate, we decided that we would have a summary for those who really wanted a quick take on our work, and a detailed version for the leaders. But we said both will be put online and on the Secretariat website. So despite this attempt at transparency and candor, we are often criticized because the scorecard was seen merely as a compliance measure and not one of impact. Well, I took, as part of the team that did this, I took the criticism in my stride. For me, it was an important first step for ASEAN. In everything that we do in ASEAN, it's so important to take that first step, build that confidence, and then take the next step. The impact of the AEC blueprint was far-reaching for the region, for ASEAN. In effect, it was the impetus for the ASEAN Community 2015. Because the economic pillar moved the deadline, or brought forward the deadline from 2020 to 2015, the other two pillars, it's fair to use the word scrambled. People from Foreign Ministry might not be too happy with me. There was this scrambling to ensure that we had documents ready for the ASEAN Community 2015. So the implementation of the AEC 2015 included a thorough review of and updating of key economic agreements. So from the free trade agreement, the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, to the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement, from the ASEAN Investment Agreement to the ASEAN Comprehensive Investment Agreement, AFAS to Trade in Services Agreement. It is not just a change in name, but in the essence, the commitment, the level of commitments in each of these agreements. So these three core agreements form the foundation for making this region the single market and production base that we espouse. So that was what we wanted to do. As we approached the year 2015, the High-Level Task Force for Economic Integration, which I chaired from 2011 to 2016, began the process of the next phase of economic integration. So we said, okay, we're getting towards that deadline of 2015, so what? What do we do next? And coincidentally, 2015, Malaysia was chair of ASEAN, so I had an extra reason, a selfish motivation, to make sure that we had something more concrete to deliver during our chairmanship. So we started working on the AEC 2025. So what is it that you want to achieve in the next 10 years? That was our question. And it was drawn up again in collaboration with the ASEAN Secretariat, the sectoral working groups, and for the first time we engaged think tanks. And so the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia area was a key player in this whole process. And more importantly, also, we engaged not just the ASEAN Business Advisory Council, but we asked that the other business advisory councils also provide inputs into the document. And in a sense, the AEC 2025 was different in that we provided drafts to the business community. And I remember as chair saying that we have to have the draft handed over to the business community so that they can make inputs, they can provide changes or suggestions, things like that. It was considered radical in its time because you don't share such documents, and some member states are not used to openly sharing draft documents with the business community. So well, for me it was simple. If this document will have an impact on business, then businesses must have a say. So, and because I was chair, I had leverage. So it was done. You know, in ASEAN, unfortunately, it's this process of negotiating with your counterparts that can tire you down more than negotiating with the business community. So anyway, this blueprint, this 2025, envisages the grouping as a highly integrated and cohesive economy, and a competitive, innovative, and dynamic ASEAN, and ASEAN, I think I have it all there, and ASEAN, which is with enhanced connectivity, deeper sectoral cooperation, a resilient, inclusive, people-oriented, people-centered ASEAN. We spend a whole lot of time on these phrases, people-centered versus people-oriented. Don't ask me. But in the end, we compromised and had it like that. And a global ASEAN. The lofty rhetoric aside, this means that ASEAN economic integration is ongoing. It's not a one-off thing. Key in the AEC 2025 will be making it easier, faster, and cheaper to do business in ASEAN. Focus is on the reduction, if not elimination, of non-tariff barriers and non-tariff measures. Equally significant is the stress on inclusive growth and sustainable development, and creating an enabling environment for ASEAN SMEs to be integrated into the regional and global supply and value chains. It lays the foundation for another important chapter in the region's economic integration. And I am blessed that I had the opportunity to be directly involved in designing both, for better or worse. There are a few master plans and action plans and strategic action plans. There's so many of this. If you were to take stock, you'll find a whole bunch. So anyways, you have the master plan for ASEAN connectivity, the ASEAN transport master plan, you have the ASEAN SME strategic action plan, and more recently, the transport ministers came up with another action plan. So all these things. So as far as this goes, we've got the bases covered. The focus now has to be on implementation and addressing gaps critical for the creation of a truly functioning economic community. The to-do list is comprehensive as it is ambitious. It is captured not only in the consolidated strategic action plan. The other thing we those of us in ASEAN, working in ASEAN, have gotten used to are this bunch of acronyms. We give Singapore a run for its money. You guys have a whole lot of acronyms as well. Anyways, so we have the Consolidated Strategic Action Plan for the AEC 2025. Then each of the action plans also have their own, action plans. For example, the CSAP has 150 measures, 513 action lines for implementation through 2025. Of these 5 measures and 28 action lines relate to connectivity. So if you're reading the Connectivity Master Plan, you must read it in connection with the AEC 2025. Otherwise, you will see duplication, you will see, waste of resources. Those are connected those related to connectivity. And these do not include the 30 specific goals and 78 action lines under the KL Master Plan for connectivity. It's an enormous task, and these are things that we will need to look at when, going forward, to make sense of all these resources that are being spent on the different master plans and the action lines, and the tracking of it is enough. I mean, it would keep you busy for a long time. Let me just say, this is what we sought to do. 2025, 2015, 2025. We've done all these, we've enumerated the many things that we need to do under the different agreements. But the reality is, we haven't done enough. What we have done for the trade side is really just the tip of the iceberg. We're very good at eliminating duties, but and the business people will say this all the time, it is not about duties, it's about all your regulations, all the, policies that just impact finally the trade, the business, how if you want to make it cheaper, easier, and faster, you have all these regulations and licenses that really will not be able, businesses will not be able to do much with it. To be fair, well, a lot of work has been going on in terms of customs facilitation, harmonization, mutual recognition agreements. We've struggled with this. The movement of natural persons, this is a big area. The seamless movement of skills is a challenge for ASEAN. We have an agreement now, an ASEAN movement of natural persons agreement, and it is about limiting access to only skills. So the non-skills, there's still no agreement. We were very, it is still a controversial subject. And when we were writing out the blueprints, countries were very careful about how we describe movement of people. We were very careful in ASEAN to emphasize that it's movement of skills and not just movement of people. Because movement of labor is a highly, highly sensitive issue in ASEAN. All right, so we had to make it very clear to people that we were talking of really the talents that we wanted, and not about unskilled labor. We have all these mutual recognition agreements from 2005 right through 2014. Again, the issue is implementing these agreements. All right? The one that is really ahead is the one on engineers, where they actually have a register of ASEAN engineers. So if you're registered in this, if you're an engineer and your name is in the ASEAN Register of Engineers, then you essentially have access to the member states. You can then work in the ASEAN member states. The others have yet to come to that level. And even so, the numbers are so limited. I think maybe 200 odd engineers. So we're trying to meet with, there's another group of engineers, aviation engineers, they're trying to meet with the ASEAN Federation of Engineers. They actually have an organization. They're quite well organized in that sense, so that they then understand how they can have this free movement of engineers. So all the others are just frameworks, they're agreements, but pretty much shell. So the reality is that there is a lot more that we need to do. We're not there yet. And even as we work to make it easier, faster to do business, we have some ways to go. And even as we're doing that, we're also engaging with our dialogue partners, and RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, poses a whole lot of challenges for ASEAN as a region. Because while we're sorting our own problems, we're engaging with other countries and then having more problems to deal with. So anyways, we'll come to that in a bit. So the creation of a seamless trading environment in ASEAN with its neighbors, and coupled with the fast-changing global environment with new technologies, new ways of doing business, and the sharing economy, requires the effective management and implementation of myriad initiatives. And I say again, implementation is key. So ASEAN, as ASEAN completes its 50th anniversary, the time is right to reconsider 3 core elements. What I've done so far is given you background, hopefully some understanding of how ASEAN works. But going forward, we need to think about these 3 core elements in our journey towards deepening economic integration. 1 is consensus decision-making process. 2 is its role in the region. And 3, its institutional structure for implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of its strategies and operations. I like to use this windshield to explain the situation we're in. We have done so much, and that's really what we see in the rear-view mirror. But if ASEAN is to go forward, it really needs to focus on going forward. And that's why we have a bigger windscreen than we have a rear-view mirror. But in many times when we are negotiating among ourselves, the rear-view mirror overwhelms the windshield. And that's why folks complain about where are we? Why is it that I don't see an economic community? What is it that you're talking about? So one big thing for us is the ASEAN Way. So the first issue is the ASEAN Way. Some commentators have said that is the reason, that's the source of ASEAN's success, because you did it in measured and step by step, you're comfortable, and therefore you take the next big step. So you don't really, get folks rattled, and they're happy to move on to the next step. But a key question underpinning regional economic integration is whether ASEAN's past achievements are enough to sustain its attractiveness and competitiveness. Perhaps ASEAN's longevity and success is in part due to its sequential, consensus, decision-making approach, the ASEAN Way. It is not the ASEAN Way to take quantum leaps or big, bold steps. Rather, ASEAN's journey towards economic integration is through gradual, comfortable steps. Yes, the ASEAN Way has worked, but given growing populism and in the face of protectionist headwinds, change is necessary. ASEAN must be bolder, more dynamic, less sanguine in dealing with issues of compliance with and implementation of its commitments. Technological developments, specifically the fourth industrial revolution, requires ASEAN to relook its way of functioning. To quote a recent World Economic Forum Asia Development Bank white paper on what the fourth industrial revolution means for economic integration, and I'm quoting here, it calls for a new way of formulating policy and regulation. The speed of change under the revolution is accelerating, and the old ways of crafting policy, especially cross-border policy, are too slow, too backward-looking, too rigid. Instead, governance and regulation need to become more agile, faster, more iterative, and experimental. And this is so important. A takeaway, one of the areas Singapore will be working on as it chairs ASEAN next year is e-commerce. Now, in that context, ASEAN has established the ASEAN E-commerce Coordinating Committee. Okay? Now, they have come up with their draft work plan. And I had a look at it. And you're talking e-commerce. E-commerce moves at the speed of light, I suppose. And here they are having policies maybe implemented in 2020. Now, I have a problem with that. So we're working with our Singapore counterparts to say, hey, folks, we need to rethink this. We cannot have the same old, and hope to, have ASEAN on the map for e-commerce. So that's number one, ASEAN Way. We have to look at it, and we have to change the way we do things. The other is ASEAN centrality. We need to give meaning to this phrase, in our decision-making and dealing with dialogue partners. Nowhere is this more relevant than in the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership negotiations, the RCEP negotiations. If you pick up the newspapers, or any document which discusses RCEP, they will preface it with the China-led Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. And I say this all the time when I have media, that RCEP is ASEAN-driven. I was in the room when we were discussing, there was this debate about where do we go with the plus ones. We were being pulled aside by one group of dialogue partners to go for ASEAN Plus 3. Then there was another group of dialogue partners which said, no, we have to do ASEAN Plus 6. And we were going along this debate for years, and there was no closure. So at one meeting, we decided to find closure, because this just couldn't work. And as the chair of the High-Level Task Force for Economic Integration, we pulled the parties together and said, okay, let's do this. Let's come up with, and this we did in discussions with Mari Pangestu, who was then Minister of Trade of Indonesia. We got her in the room and bounced ideas of her. And so we have these two proposals. Where is ASEAN? So that was how we came up with the concept of the RCEP we came up with a framework guidelines, the guidelines for the RCEP. And in essence, it said, it's whoever is ready. So you drop your guidelines. So it doesn't matter if it's 3, if it's 4, it's 5, it's 6. Whoever is ready can sign on to it. That was the basis of RCEP. Well, today it's morphed into a +6, and people are married to that idea. I'm still convinced that, you know, if folks are not ready, they're not ready. So they shouldn't be a drag on the negotiations. But that's just me. Anyway, so coming back to ASEAN centrality, this is an ASEAN-initiated agreement. RCEP is an ASEAN-initiated agreement, and it will be a test, ultimately, of ASEAN's ability to provide economic leadership. The completion of this negotiation would validate ASEAN's role in economic integration of this region and global trade and investment. RCEP, because of the parties, you've got Japan, Korea, China, maybe New Zealand and Australia on one side, Singapore, and then you've got CLM on the other side. So the balance, now if we manage to have that balance written into this agreement, it can be a 21st century model for inclusive integration among countries of widely varying levels of development, but with common aspirations for robust development and deeper economic engagement with one another and the rest of the world. It can also be key in shaping the free trade agreement of the Asia-Pacific. And herein lies the challenge and opportunity for ASEAN in the global trading environment. Now, I've said that. I mean, are we, ASEAN, the question around ASEAN centrality, are you shaping the rules, or are you being led by the dialogue partners? So that's so important for me. We have to make sure, if we say that the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is ASEAN-driven, then we have to make sure we drive the process and not be a drag on the process. So anyways, coming back to the implementation issue, this is my third point. I think it's necessary to review the institutional structure for implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of the strategies, measures, initiatives, processes, and procedures. ASEAN needs to take a more holistic and systemic approach in the implementation of its initiatives. It needs to work with think tanks, research institutes, academia, private sector. And I'm going to give you 2 examples. One is this. Remember I talked about non-tariff measures, which is the bottom part of your iceberg. There is where you have all the unnecessary regulatory burdens. You have the lack of transparency. You have issues of multi-agency processes. Now, the middle, where you have all those flags, that's ASEAN. ASEAN on its own cannot manage these issues because it will need, I've used IRIA here as an example. What IRIA has done in this case, it's created a database of non-tariff measures. So if you go onto that website that I've got there, you will see the non-tariff measures by line, by tariff line, by country. All right, so it gives you an idea of the pain an industry would need to go through if you were to expect. And we've done some breakdown. The Malaysia EU chambers, for example, has done some analysis and found that the bulk, for Malaysia anyways, the bulk of the non-tariff measures are in the food and beverage sector. So then they have to now work with government, highlight to government which are relevant and which are not. I mean, if there are safety concerns, if they're based on some international standards, we can still handle those concerns. But if we do not have an appreciation of where these non-tariff measures is coming from, now if you have to apply for 10 licenses to export one item, it doesn't make sense. So this website gives you an idea of the non-tariff measures, but that's just one part of the picture, right? So while IRIA can provide the research support and even get down to calculating transaction costs, it is the business community really that must work with the Secretariat and push for greater transparency and push for a reduction of those measures which don't make sense. So, and they need to also prioritize and tell us, because, there's 10,000 lines, for example. So government will say, oh, too many, I can't do this. So if they can prioritize and say, work on these. So the EU MCCI, for example, the EU Malaysia Chambers, what they've done is they've decided their priority would be food and beverage. So they're working through that and then having that engagement either directly with the member state or through the ASEAN Secretariat. So there has to be this mechanism of us working more in a more systemic, more integrated fashion. So the role of think tanks, the business players is so important. Another example is, sorry, let me just go back. On trade facilitation. Now, in the 2017, in Philippines, as chair, Philippines wanted this as a takeaway. The ASEAN Seamless Trade Facilitation Indicators. They wanted to, not quite the World Bank ease of doing business sort of indicators. They wanted very specific to ASEAN. And so based on the ASEAN agreements, so IRIA working with, again, the ASEAN body called the ASEAN Trade Facilitation Joint Consultative Committee, ATF-JCC, and the ASEAN Business Advisory Council, we are working to come up with the ASTFI. We're almost there. It's taken 9 months. We're getting there. So the indicators it's not quite the World Bank beauty contest of the ease of doing business, but it provides an indication, an idea of where the different member states are when it comes to trade facilitation. So you would compare customs across ASEAN, how do they function, the behind-the-border measures in Singapore versus Thailand versus Indonesia. So you get a lot more transparency of the process. We know it, businesses will be able to tell you, governments know it intuitively, but if it's not in your face, you don't do anything about it. You can give a million reasons why you shouldn't do anything about it. So we hope that with this, these indicators in place, folks will have less of an excuse not to take action. So those are things that again, are coming out of collaboration, alignment and collaboration with the different parts of ASEAN. IRIA is part of an ASEAN entity, likewise the ASEAN Business Advisory Council. So the Secretariat itself and the member states themselves cannot do this on their own. They need that additional push from the private sector. Those are just two examples. In addition, institutional structure review is necessary as regional trade and investment cannot be the domain of the ASEAN economic pillar alone. ASEAN needs to move away from operating in its 3 pillars, the social security, the economic, and the social cultural pillars. We need to dismantle that. We need to find ways to collaborate across the 3 pillars. Right now, they are very siloed and very married to their area. E-commerce, for example, this is not just about economics. It's not just about trade facilitation or logistics or physical connectivity or consumer protection. It also encompasses security, both on the movement of the physical product and data. So it belongs not quite to the economic pillar. And it also involves skills development to enable SMEs and youth in the region to take advantage of opportunities afforded by this new way of doing business. Again, there's an area by training and all, which is not quite the economic pillar competence. So we cannot just leave them in their silos. We need to find ways to work across the 3 pillars. Another example, the business community has consistently been pushing for a single visa for seamless travel across ASEAN. We've been pushing for this, but while facilitating business is the competence of the economic pillar. But it is not just about facilitating business. It is about working with the immigration authorities, and that comes under the political security pillar. And that's a difficult pillar to move, because the priorities are different. Okay, so that's why, even as we had it as a deliverable when Malaysia was chair, we didn't get anywhere with it. And again, the business community keeps raising this up. But I think you have to be patient in ASEAN and keep pushing and pushing till somebody does something about it. But if you just bang on the door of the economic pillar, there's only so much these folks can do. You also, as the business community also needs to go knock on the door of the political security pillar. What I'm saying is this operations in terms of silos works to the disadvantage of ASEAN in integration and the business community. So you need to have this whole of ASEAN, what I'm calling a whole of ASEAN approach, which would enable the region to take a critical look at the compliance with and commitments made, including ratification and implementation of agreements. It also means better alignment across plans and blueprints, coordination among ASEAN, among those international, regional and multinational bodies, and enhance engagement with the private sector, research institutes, and civil society. So as I look back from where we came in 1967, through the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, through AEC 2015, AEC 2025, the region has indeed much to be proud of. But what worked in the past, need not work today. Global developments provide an opportunity for ASEAN to lead the way in economic integration, and more importantly, inclusive economic integration. So perhaps after this 50-year experiment, we are ready for radical change as we chart the next course, the next 50 years. The ASEAN spirit has to permeate our society, such that we feel and think ASEAN. One example given, this is one of my things I keep repeating, is, when you see it, you feel it. Like if you're entering the EU, you would have at your immigration counter EU passports and then non-EU, right? If you're came into Changi this afternoon, you have all passports, you have an APAC lane and a PR lane. There is no ASEAN lane. Okay, that's Singapore. Maybe in your chairmanship you might have an ASEAN lane. There is, but you're not alone. There is no ASEAN lane in Indonesia. Philippines created an ASEAN lane during their chairmanship. Malaysia has an ASEAN lane. The CLM are very good. CLMV, they've had ASEAN lanes for years. So, I mean, that's like in your face. So you actually strike the consciousness of folks. When you're on arrival, you're seeing these two things. The other thing that we tried also is, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, I'm not sure. I said on the liveries, of the planes, if you could have an ASEAN logo along with your SIA and this and that. This year, AirAsia did it. AirAsia had I Love ASEAN on their planes. It was fun. I mean, it was fun the way they did it, but at least it's a start. I think those are things, those in-your-face things help folks feel ASEAN. We've done a number of studies with young ASEAN students and asked them, what is ASEAN to you? And you'll be surprised at the level of awareness of ASEAN. I know in Malaysia when we did it, folks, the students couldn't tell the difference between ASEAN and Asia. That's a sad story. So then we put in place certain initiatives to involve. See, this is again a function of us thinking in our silos. The Ministry of International Trade and Industry, we only, well, to a large extent, we only work with businesses. But when we had Minister Mustafa come in, and he was from the Higher Education Ministry, he wanted us to engage with university students, and we went like, why? And, we are the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, not higher education. So we said minister should shed his higher education skin, But because he's minister and because he insisted, we had to do it. So we bussed the kids to MITI, and we had dialogues with them and explanations. Chihao is Malaysia's new trade representative here, economic representative to Singapore. And we explained ASEAN to them. That's when I found out they couldn't tell the difference between ASEAN and Asia. But really, a lot more of these things need to be done. And like I said, I'm in spite of the title, I am an optimist. I always see the glass half full. And I know that ASEAN has some ways to go. I'm critical of ASEAN, but I'm also passionate about ASEAN. And like I said, the spirit has to permeate our society. And this is the next big challenge for us, to ensure that ASEAN is integral to our political, social, and economic realities. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll take questions.
As we open up to questions, can I invite people to come up to the microphones? And I know many of you feel that your voice is powerful enough, we can hear it from here. But what we would like is to be recorded as well, and for the whole audience to be able to hear you, not just us.
This is from East Asia Institute. I have two questions. First is that in the last 50 years of ASEAN, the intra-ASEAN trade hovers around 20 to 25. There's no increase as compared to NAFTA and EU. And one of the complaints is that there's no resolution, the mechanisms for disputes. So every member countries interpret the free trade or whatever in their own way. So there's a feeling that probably the ASEAN Secretariat should be strengthened, but they also said the budget is below 20 million, and the equal sharing principle does not allow ASEAN Secretariat to expand its functions. So do you think that this modification of the contribution system should be part of your 2025 plan? That's the first question. The second question is, International Labour Organization just released a report saying that because of this fourth industrial revolution, automation, robotizations, as much as 40 to 50% of ASEAN jobs on the global supply chain in 5 key industries might be lost in the next 10 years. And he has a very on-the-side comment is that because of this shrinkage of global supply chains opportunity to ASEAN countries, many of the ASEAN countries may become competitors in attracting foreign investments. So if this scenario pans out, how do you modify your recommendations in the 2025 plans for ASEAN?
I would just like to touch upon one of the issues that you made during your talk regarding RCEP, that if countries are not ready, then others should be able to go ahead. Are you saying that the ASEAN minus X approach should be applied to RCEP? Because if that's the case, when it was done within the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, for example, Malaysia with automobiles or Indonesia with clothes or the Philippines with petrochemicals, that approach was implied, but then it was also you needed the protocols to then implement it later on. So do you think that it's actually feasible to have that in an international agreement that goes beyond the ASEAN members?
I was especially intrigued by your comments on economic issues or economic pillars and security pillars being silo, and you suggested that there should be more communication between the two. If I think about not just ASEAN, but the wider region, ASEAN Plus 3 or ASEAN 6, especially because you stressed inclusiveness being an important element of wider integration. As we all know, there are some countries that are allies of the United States and others are not. How do you think this structure unfolding in the future, especially that you give stress on inclusiveness?
Intra-ASEAN trade, yes, it hovers around 25, 26%. If you're looking at it in terms of percentages, I always say, well, if you look at the spread, it has increased. In terms of value, it has grown. One reason also is, I think one needs to take into account the value chains, as well as the fact that we are competitors in that sense. Our trade is really, we do similar trades as opposed to the EU or NAFTA. So that's one explanation. It's less so of the SMEs. Everybody talks of the dispute settlement mechanism that we have, which is not used. So I used to get very upset because when we had issues, I think with Indonesia, it went to the World Trade Organization and not to ASEAN. We have an enhanced dispute settlement mechanism, but it is not tested. There was one time when, I can't remember whether it was sugar or rice was an issue. And, ASEAN being ASEAN, we say, oh, let's not have family squabbles in public, So the ministers met and we sorted it out. We didn't really use the dispute mechanism, although I know I was asked to be part of the panel, but in the end it never materialized because that's the ASEAN way. We don't wash dirty linen in public, we're very nice. But at some point, this has to change. At some point, we have to have a dispute settlement mechanism which is effective. We need to do that. We need to make sure that is in place. Otherwise, this nice ASEAN cannot take us far. The ASEAN Secretariat issue and financial contributions, this has been on the table for a very long time. We all know that that's a shortcoming, but you must also understand that when we conceived of the ASEAN and the ASEAN Secretariat, when we were doing the ASEAN Charter, we talked of a strengthening of the ASEAN Secretariat, not the empowering of the ASEAN Secretariat. We didn't want a strong center. It is still member state driven. And I really think that is something, maybe the time has come to look at it, But that's now, that idea, we have this two-tier system, right, of CLM V, now V has moved, and then the rest of ASEAN. And that has worked. This two-tier system has been key in our inclusive approach to economic integration. And with Brexit, with Brexit coming into play, folks are saying, yeah, because the two-tier system was part of the early thinking of the EU, right? And it didn't go down that route. But in hindsight, we're saying, hey, look, maybe there is some value to that. So that's been the formula that we've used, for better or worse, the inclusiveness. And to be fair to ASEAN, we've worked into the system ways to narrow our development gap. So we have the integration of ASEAN initiative, where ASEAN member states help the CLM in different areas of human capital development, in terms of projects, in terms of agricultural development. This is in place. Questions around how effective it is, how it can be better. One shortfall is, of course, funding. Among ourselves, we can't put in as much money as, say, because we don't have a funding organization like the Asia Development Bank or ASEAN Development Bank. We don't have that. So that is a shortcoming. Although the finance ministers, when they meet, they do talk about how we can support each other in this concept of inclusive growth. Financial contributions, this round at the summit, there is a loose group of folks. We call ourselves the ASEAN Advisory Group, very loose. And we work with the World Economic Forum on ASEAN. And we put up a white paper, and I quoted that white paper earlier. And that was presented to the leaders this time. And included in that were the proposals, or rather highlighting concerns about contribution, and that everybody pays the same. At some point, we need to revisit it and really take a call on how contributions are to the Secretariat. Secretariat's budget is very, very small in the scheme of things, and that's why a lot of things cannot be done. Then that goes back to our own principle of member-driven. Okay, so there is that. Those are things that we need to sort out as we look at the next phase of ASEAN integration. I think the fourth industrial revolution, questions around that, the debate around that is still going on. Folks talk about jobs being lost. But for every job that's lost, another is created because of the fourth industrial revolution. I remember when I joined the Ministry of Trade and Industry in 1981, we had this concept of a typing pool. So you write your stuff on pen and paper, and you put it in a pool, a basket. And the typists come and take it out, and they type it, and they give it back to you. Okay, so with the computers and all those folks have lost jobs, but I'm sure they have found other work, right? So anyways, for every, I think in every revolution, every job that's lost, another is created. But a higher skilled, higher level job, and so it's up to us then to look at human capital development, relook our TVET programs, relook our school curricula. I mean, those are things that have to be done. I mean, it's no use sitting at the back and crying, oh, I'm going to lose my job. You know it's going to come, so you do something about it. The RCEP, ASEAN Minor X, I mean, a lot of the opinions given on RCEP Minor did not necessarily reflect an ASEAN position. See, when we were drafting the guidelines for RCEP, we tried to be as practical about it as possible. So what do you want out of this engagement? One, we wanted it to be a plus to the ASEAN Plus One FTAs that we already have. What is the real issue with the ASEAN Plus One FTAs as they exist? Each FTA has its own set of rules. So if you are a manufacturer, talking of goods now, if you're a manufacturer exporting under the different FTAs, you have to have separate lines, as it were, because each FTA has a different set of rules and different set of forms. All right, so we said, first things first, let's try and harmonize the rules across these FTAs. Easier said than done. Now, that's one of the struggles under RCEP today, trying to streamline the rules of origin. Because on the one hand, you have very liberal ASEAN rules of origin and equally liberal rules of origin for ASEAN China, but on the other end, you have you have a set of much stricter rules of origin from the ASEAN India FTA. So bridging these rules is a challenge and a half, and that's one of the areas that the negotiators are struggling with. So for sure, we wanted an improvement to the Plus One FTAs. We wanted to make sure that it is more trade facilitating for the businesses dealing with us. So in that sense, you would then see an integrated ASEAN Plus Six emerging. But we also went in with our eyes open. We knew that there's going to be difficulties in some of the countries. So that's why we said it could be ASEAN Plus 3, ASEAN Plus 4, ASEAN Plus 5, ASEAN Plus 6. But the political reality is ASEAN Plus 5 may not work for some countries. Because, to be fair, the attractiveness of RCEP, the value of RCEP, is the presence of India and China. These are the sexy chaps in the agreement. All right? If India is not there or China is not there, it's nothing. And I'm saying it very candidly. Again, that's my opinion. And so, for that reason, an ASEAN minus X. Now, who's that X? Australia, New Zealand, India? So, depending, it may not be an attractive proposition. Have we done something similar? ASEAN has. In the ASEAN Korea Free Trade Agreement, we had Indonesia delaying ratification. They signed, but delayed ratification. All right. But again, this is the role of the business community. Now, so the ASEAN minus Indonesia went ahead to implement the ASEAN Korea Agreement. The business community in Indonesia realized, oops, what's going on here, folks? You know, we are the losers here, and put pressure on the government, and in the end, Indonesia ratified the agreement. So we have had examples of agreements like that. So experiences like that, rather. So, but in the case of RCEP, when we say minus X, we mean minus the party, not minus ASEAN. Okay. I hope I've answered the question on inclusiveness. It is one of the biggest challenge for us to ensure that no one is left behind. I think that's why over the years we have made it a point to focus on small and medium enterprises and even micro, small and medium enterprises, because those are the ones that can either benefit or lose from ASEAN economic integration. Economic integration, for sure, has made ASEAN more attractive for investors, foreign investors. And you know, when investors come, the tendency, and we've seen this happening in Malaysia, the tendency is when the MNCs move, they moved with their vendors, and therefore displacing some of ours. So what we've done in Malaysia is to have structured programs where we link Malaysian small and medium enterprises with MNCs, where the Malaysian MNCs or we persuade, we can't force, we persuade the bigger companies to work with our SMEs, whether upgrading them or sharing technology or along those lines. Again, it's about being aware of what's happening and what you want and how you can help. To the extent you leverage on what you can. When you talk about the political versus the economic side, really at the economic side, we look at, that's why for the RCEP, it was very, very clear. We said FTAs. We're starting with countries we have FTAs with. So you don't have any problems with it, because we don't have FTA with the US or with Russia. You know, so those two are out of that 6 loop, right? But in the event of also the EU, I forget the EU all the time. In the event the US decides that they've looked at the package that we were negotiating for RCEP, and they say, something that worthwhile for me to do, they can actually apply to be a party to it. The guidelines are open enough for accession. But how the negotiations go and how the parties, the final document will deal with accession is another matter. I can't preempt that. But I'm saying the door is not closed to other parties coming in at some point.
Thank you for that. I want to thank the audience for your attention. But if I could invite you to thank Country.